Good morning, Hemshech Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on the bottom of page 1457. So the continuing discussion of Mehus HaEtzem, which is the expression used in the verse in Shir HaShirim, where it says, Shcheira ani v'nova, that the souls below say, I am dark and beautiful. And who are they saying it to Mehus HaEtzem? These are the souls in Atzilus, like he says, Neshamas kashem b'bchinas ibur b'bchinas malchus. They're called Mehus HaEtzem, but the neshamas are in a state of pregnancy, meaning they already exist, but they're still part of Atzilus, Malchus of Atzilus, like we learned earlier. They're called Mehus HaEtzem because they're in a state of Shleimus Hayira. And before that, we were learning in the previous paragraph a little more details about neshamas of Atzilus, that there are different types of souls. There are souls that all souls originate in Atzilus, in that state of Ibur, in that pregnancy stage, so to speak. But then there are souls as they're born and they become a separate entity, even the neshamas of Atzilus. And then there's the distinctions. There are neshamas that remain souls of Atzilus even when they come down below, like Moshe Rabbeinu. There are souls that become Atzilus, but they manifest in Biyah. So they take on some filter like Avram Avinu. But through the Nisyanis, through his tests, especially the last test of the Akedah, that led him and elevated his soul to be like a neshama of Atzilus Mamish, representing Chesed of Atzilus on earth. And then there are souls that manifest completely in Biyah. And every individual soul has all levels. And he broke it down to 4 levels. Atzilus Tahirihi, Atzilus Beriyah Sheba Atzilus is a Barasa. Atzilus Beriyah is Yisarta, and Biyah itself is Nefachta Bi, as we learned. So right now, when we talk about neshamas, all neshamas are rooted in that original state in Atzilus. They're in a state of Shleimus Hayira, because what radiates in them is the Kav from Eid Ein Sof that radiates into the 10 spheres of Atzilus. That's why they're that state of Bittul B'Mitzias. And the same is true about neshamas of Atzilus in general. Even also including Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. He's talking now the higher levels, Moshe and Avram. Because Atzilus is Gilead Mehus HaEtzem, because Atzilus is the very personality of the divine is revealed there. That's why the Mehus HaEtzem are in a state of Shleimus Hayira. I want to just point out one more thing that came to mind. In the analogy that he's giving of the mother and the fetus, it's interesting, actually, even though he doesn't say it explicitly, but when you think of the exact example, what you have is like this. You have the mother, then there's the conception of a child that takes hold on Shmini Atzeres, like he said. So you have a fetus developing within the womb, and the fetus is connected with an umbilical cord and receiving directly from the mother. The sustenance, like he said, it eats what its mother eats, and so on. So if you think about it, in the nimshal, in the moral, you also have the same idea. In order for there to be existence, we know there's a tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is a space. It's like a womb that allows room for another entity to develop, which would be the fetus. But it's connected by a kav. The kav is the umbilical cord, the life force, the artery, the fuel line, the power line, whatever you want to call it, the main artery that sustains the fetus within the womb. So the mashal really works well in that sense because you have everything here. You have the elokus, is like in this case the mother. The womb is like the space where the fetus develops, and the kav is the line of energy, is the thread and the channel that channels the energy and sustains that the fetus. So in Ruchnius, that's what we're talking about. That levels the neshamas as they are still encompassed in Malchus of Atzilus. So that's a summary of what we've learned. Now, I'm going to go to the parentheses that yesterday I skipped. I only went to the line afterwards, so I'll read the parentheses that elaborates a bit more on this level of Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. So it's the fourth line from the new paragraph, from the second paragraph on page 1457, the line that begins Bechinas Atzilus Sheba Beriyah, and he says, Hashamas Atzilus Bechlal, including Atzilus Sheba Beriyah, being that it's Atzilus Bechinas Gilead Mehus HaEtzem. So he's saying now Atzilus is where you have the personality of the divine is revealed. And that's why the neshamas that are there experience total bittul, shleimus hayira. Not just yira ilah, which he called bittul b'mitzias. They're totally subsumed, completely absorbed in the divine consciousness. So now he says like this in the parentheses. U'kamoy Gan Eden HaElyon. Like Gan Eden HaElyon. We know Gan Eden, there's a Gan Eden HaElyon, there's a Gan Eden HaTachton. Generally speaking, Gan Eden HaElyon is in Beriyah. Gan Eden HaTachton is in Yetzirah, sometimes also in Asiyah. So he says, like Gan Eden HaElyon. So till now, he didn't mention this. We learned about it a lot earlier, which he's going to refer to, but he's saying now. So Gan Eden HaElyon, what level is Gan Eden HaElyon? Shezehu b'chinas Atzilus sheba Beriyah. So now he's giving us a little more information on this location called Atzilus within Beriyah. Because remember, I pointed out, he doesn't really specify what's the difference between Atzilus Mamish, Atzilus Sheba Atzilus, so to speak, and Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. All he said was that that's Moshe the first, Atzilus Mamish, and Atzilus Sheba Beriyah is Avram before the Nisyanis. Avram on his own, the Psik Taima. That's why Avram is a Psik Taima, because Avram on his own is already a level of Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. Now he's giving us what level that is. He says, Gan Eden HaElyon shezehu b'chinas Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. That's Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. We know Gan Eden HaElyon is not Atzilus Mamish, because at Gan Eden HaElyon you have actual neshamas that are not encompassed like in the womb. In Atzilus, the neshamas are encompassed in the womb. Even when there's Leda, the birth of the souls, it's still like we learned in Atzilus. Where the neshamas become a separate entity, well, actually, I should say, Yotzu and Nifradu, even in Atzilus, they separate from the Kalim. But where does it really manifest is in the world of Beriyah. Atzilus Sheba Beriyah, Hari Hasogas HaNeshamas began Eden, Hu B'chinas Hasogas HaMehus. So he's explaining now that though Gan Eden HaElyon is not Atzilus Mamish, but Atzilus is radiating in it. Remember, it's not Biyam Mamish either. It's somewhat of a hybrid. Atzilus, which means the Gilead of Atzilus has gone through the Parsa, so there is an element of a partition, and it has made a leap, but it's still radiating with a lot of intensity from Atzilus. That's what the Neshamas and Gan Eden are like. So you'll say, so what is the difference between that and Beriyah itself and Biyah itself? She says, "A commotion is boiled the ilah heifers being Gan Eden ve'elam." He explained that earlier, a lot earlier, when we talked about Gan Eden and the world. He explained that when you say Gan Eden, when God created the world, He created the whole world, and in that world He created a Gan Eden, and that's where He placed Adam and Chava. I'm talking about Pusha physically. So you see from that, Gan Eden is a loftier and a higher state of consciousness than the rest of the world. So the same thing is today, Beruchnius. When you say Gan Eden in Beriyah is higher than the world itself. As he explained there, that Gan Eden is Gan Eden ve'elam. Gan Eden is a deeper level of divine revelation in that very world. So here you have Atzilus is Mamish, Atzilus Mamish. Then Atzilus in Beriyah, what he called is Gan Eden HaElyon, which is higher than Beriyah itself. So he says, so therefore, there you have, that's the level that he's referring to when he says, that's not just the Neshamas of Atzilus Mamish, but also the Neshamas of Atzilus as they go into Beriyah, which is in Gan Eden HaElyon, they have Asogas Elikus of the Mehus Mamish of Elikus. So obviously it's not quite as it is in Atzilus. Like for example, when we say the difference between the prophecy of Moshe and the prophecy of the other prophets. So we learned earlier that Moshe prophesied with the word zeh. He was able to see directly godliness. The other prophets prophesied with the word koi, like. When you say zeh, this, it's like pointing to it in the first person. When you say koi, you're saying it's like something, like the likeness, it's a reflection of. So both are seeing a divine revelation, but it's very different. That would be Atzilus Mamish Moshe. Atzilus Shebebriya is still Hasagas HaMehus. That's why Gan Eden HaElyon, whereas Beriyah itself is another step down. But he's now referring to this level of Atzilus Shebebriya, which is Hasagas HaMehus of the Neshamas in Gan Eden HaElyon. But nevertheless, it's still not Atzilus Mamish. U'makol mokim b'chinas ziv teirosen v'avidosen. One second. Now, let me correct myself. Nevertheless, it is lower than Atzilus Mamish, period. Now, he's going to explain something further. We learned earlier, and this I need to elaborate before we read on here, because he's very, very brief here. We learned that there were several levels here. When God created existence, he created existence with different levels, as we know. There's a difference in Atzilus, Beriyah, Yetzir, Asiyah. In Beriyah itself, there's a difference in Gan Eden and the world of Beriyah. So it'd be like the difference, like in the physical world. God created a whole world. He created Europe, Asia, America, and there was one part of the world which is called Gan Eden. And Gan Eden, there was the Shechina was in Gan Eden. Well, you could say it was in general Tachtenim, but especially in Gan Eden. And that's why Gan Eden was filled with trees and delights, because it was a special Gili of Elikus. Then came the next step. Adam and Chava are placed in Gan Eden, and their job, the Avodah L'Shomer, is to work the field, is to work the garden, and make it thrive and multiply even more than what Hashem planted into the world itself. So you have the physical world, you have Deimim, Tzemeya, Chai, a world filled with mineral, vegetation, animal, also a world with Gan Eden in it, with trees, and all the pleasures and divine revelation as much as God planted into Gan Eden. The human being, through the Avodah of a human being, adds and increases. You may recall he discussed this at length. I'll tell you exactly what page. We're going back now quite a while, back to Gan Eden. We were talking here, we spoke about how Avodah adds to Gan Eden. So, here we are. We go to page 1254. I'm going to read a line or two from there. So, in 1254, yeah, Aleph Resh Nun Daled, after a long arichus, we're talking about mutfa, murgish, muskel, the growth of a person through our Avodah as we grow and mature from a behavioral state to an emotional state to a cognitive state, all the way up to atik and arich, as he explained. So there on page 454, he went back to what he discussed in the beginning of volume 3 on page 1211. All the way, yeah. So what does he say? He says, "Ha'hefresh ben Gan Eden mitzad atzma, u'bein hamshacha beGan Eden shemamshichim teisvu seder al-yedei Avodah." So now we have a third level. You have the world of Beriyah itself, or Yetzir and Asiyah as well. You have Gan Eden and Beriyah that God created, and now you have what the Avodah of the human being in the garden that increases even more energy. And that's what he goes on to discuss on page 1254, what Avodah adds. So now he's referring back all that to where we are right now. So here we also have Neshamas come from Atzilus. Then Atzilus, there's a level of Atzilus in Beriyah, or in Biyah. That is the level of Gan Eden HaElyon. The Neshamas are there, and that level is higher than Beriyah on its own. But then there's something that happens through the Avodah of Neshamas. The Avodah of Neshamas elevates it even more. So that's what he's going to go on now to explain. That even though Gan Eden is higher than the world itself of Beriyah, but now, nevertheless, through the Ziv, through the reflection of their Torah and their Avodah, of the Neshamas, That's far greater and far higher than Gan Eden alone, as I just read from page 1254. Because Gan Eden is indeed drawing of Atzilus within Beriyah, like we just explained, but it's only the reflection of the Kav. So though it's higher than Beriyah itself and so on its own, but it's still only a reflection of the Kav. That's even Atzilus is a reflection of the Kav. It's true, it's the Mehus HaElyon we learned, but it's not the highest level. In a way, the Rebbe Rashab is already giving us a taste of what happens through Avodah down below. So it's still, and Bufrat Atzilus Shebebiyah. She'ein ze kamei ba'Atzilus kanal. That's not at the same level as Atzilus. So it's true, it's a high level of revelation, but it's still not the highest level. Ubederech klal hu gili Mehus HaZiv. In general, that level is the revelation of the Mehus HaZiv. It's the personality of the reflection. So you could have the personality. Mehus itself is Mehus HaEtzem. Mehus HaZiv means the difference between Mehus HaEtzem and Mehus HaZiv is Mehus is the personality of the sun itself. Mehus HaZiv is the personality of the sunlight. And then there's Metzias HaZiv, the existence of the sunlight. So though Mehus HaZiv is higher than Metzias, meaning that Atzilus, which is Mehus HaElyon, like we've been learning, and Atzilus Shebebriyah is also that way, on a lower level. So it's Mehus, but it's Mehus HaZiv. It's still a Mehus of the reflection. By the Torah mitzvahs, however, when a person below does Torah mitzvahs, nimshech Mehus HaEtzem. Now you're getting the Mehus HaEtzem, not just Mehus HaZiv. U'kamoishin is ba'il'il, as was explained earlier, where we learned this more at length. So now, even though this seems to be, like you could say, out of place, because we're still talking about the neshamas above, Bnei Yerushalayim, but that's why perhaps it's in the parentheses, that this is already leading us to teach us something that we haven't learned yet. Till now, we've been learning about how high the level of neshamas are on their own. Neshamas of Atzilus, Ibur, like he called it, Kalim, that they're absorbed and they're connected to the Shleimus Hayira. Then we talked about Atzilus Shebebriyah or Shebebriyah, but he's talking about Gan Eden. Now he's mentioning the Avodah, that neshamas, through their Avodah, they go higher. Similar to like Avram Avinu, through his Avodah, he went also higher. Avram went from Atzilus Shebebriyah to Atzilus Mamish. And through the neshamas Lamata, we go to Mehus HaZiv to Mehus HaEtzem. But we'll soon understand more of that as we go on. But that's the parentheses that he adds. And then he says, well, Cain, back to before the parentheses, because it's Gilei Mehus HaElyon, that's why they're in the state of Bnei Yerushalayim, Shleimus Hayira. That's the neshamas on their own. And through Avodah, we're going to learn that they go even higher, that he's already alluding to in this parentheses. So that's the addition of the parentheses that we didn't learn yesterday. I wanted to go over it now. And that's that. So before I continue, any questions? Okay. Good. So let's continue on. So we read Al-Kain B'chinas B'nei
Mehus HaEtzem is Atzilus itself, no?
It's higher than Atzilus itself.
Uh-huh.
There's Atzilus as God created it with revelation. And then there's what happens through Avodah. So we talked, if you go back to Atzilus, you'll see he kept saying Ha'aras HaKav. The reflection of the Kav is Atzilus, the Kav itself. The Kav stops at the Parsa, but the Kav itself, but it's still a reflection of the Kav. But it's the Mehus of that reflection. Like I said, like the Mehus, the personality of the sunlight. Mehus HaEtzem, yeah. If you look on page 1456, he says, but if you read a line before, you see clearly, he says, Ha'aras HaKav. Ha'aras HaKav. And this is understood a lot better when you go back to the pages I referred to back in 1250, in that area of 1254. the difference between Gan Eden before Avodah and Gan Eden after Avodah. It's a pretty long discussion there. Yeah.
Okay.
Is
Now
Gan
keep in
Eden
mind again, that if you stay away from the mechanics and the mathematics of this, you'll be able to understand, because it's not just a bunch of words. There's a very big difference between appreciating the reflection of the divine, there's the existence of that reflection, the Mehus and personality of it. So you have to go back to the example, either example of a teacher and a student, or other examples that can be used to explain what we're exactly experiencing. So we all know in any type of growth, there are many levels. That which you know today, you learn today something new, you know more or less the mitzias of it. Mitzias means you know it exists, but you can't say I really get it. I really get its personality. You meet someone for the first time, you can't say you know their Mehus, you know their mitzias. They exist. Maybe you get a little glimpse of what type of person it is. Then when you get to know somebody, you start getting to know their Mehus. But the Mehus is not necessarily the Mehus of the Mehus. The Mehus could be you knowing the personality of a deeper part of them, but it's still a reflection. A Mehus of a Mehus HaEtzem, as he puts it here, is already getting to know the person. We talked, but not just a reflection of the person, knowing the personality of that, but the very essence of the person. To use the example I often use with the artist, you see a piece of art, you know there's a mitzias of an artist. That's all you know. You study the art a bit, you can start learning a bit about this artist. How much? However far you can go. Then you meet the artist. And now you meet the artist, you start realizing there's much more to him as an artist than you knew from the art itself. You see other pieces of art. So you start discovering that he has other dimensions to him in his art, all as an artist. So you get to know not just the mitzias of the artist, you're getting to know the Mehus of the artist, but still as an artist. Then you discover, 1 second, this artist also happens to be a father or a mother. He also happens to be a scholar. He's a teacher. He has another 50 qualities, just as an example. So you're realizing everything I knew about him, even the personality of his being an artist, is still only in the world of his being an artist. What about the other parts of him? I didn't even know that he existed. So there begins another journey, mitzias and Mehus. So you can keep going until you say, do I really know the essence of this person? So with a human being, ultimately, all human beings are finite, so it doesn't go endlessly. But even with a human being, we know. How much do we know, even of ourselves? How much do you really know about your etzem neshama? You know about your behavior. You know about your conscious faculties, maybe a little about your superconscious. But how deep have you gone, and how deep are you aware of? There are many dimensions within us we're not even aware of ourselves, let alone another person. Now take all this and multiply it infinite times with God, which is obviously far, far beyond, and you come away with how many levels are there? Infinite amount of levels. You get to know the mitzias of the Eibishter through the world he created. Then you come to learn more about him as a creator, as an artist. Then you come to discover that he's not just an artist, there's more to him. Then you come to discover even that which is more to him is also not his ikar, is only a reflection, like we said, loize ikar alakus. It's not the primary thing of God is to create. It's not the primary thing of God even to give off oil. So you keep going, you realize the mystique and the mystery of how much there is beyond. You start realizing how many levels of mitzias and Mehus are there. So this is the only way to really appreciate these levels. Because if you just quantify it with words, Mehus, Mehus HaZiv, Mehus HaEtzem, Atzilus Beriyah, Beriyah, etc. Those are the names, but you have to understand what they mean. And they really are different levels of experiencing the very personality of godliness. And it's a long journey. And so it's not surprising that a person who lives in this world and is barely touching the surface, scratching the surface of Asir Ruchnius, is already a elevated level compared to being a materialistic human being. But then there's Yitzira, and then there's Beriyah, and there's Atzilus Beriyah, and there's Beriyah Atzilus, and then there's Atzilus Mamish. And even that is also ultimately Mehus HaZiv. Then through Avodah, the neshamas are able to access their source that's higher than all of Atzilus and higher than Torah and so on. which we're going to learn about. That's the shcheirani, the souls as they come down below. That's ultimately why a soul comes down below. It will reach levels higher than the soul was above. Because if the soul only gets back to Atzilus, what was achieved? You don't want it to go back to square. The journey is not just to return to where you began. You have to go higher than where you began. That's the whole point of making a dira b'tachtenim, of transforming this world and bringing Mashiach. Mashiach is not just bringing back the world to the way it was in Gan Eden before the sin of the the tree of knowledge. And that's part of this whole discussion that really brings us back also to, I said, Gan Eden, if you remember that whole discussion about Gan Eden, the Avodah that we do, that increases divine revelation. That's the mitzvahs that we do. So in this parentheses, there's a lot more than what it appears. It's already capturing this bigger picture. So I'm just elaborating more just to unpack it all. But it's going to become clear as we learn now, because we're still talking about the neshamas as they're descending. The parentheses, as I said, gave us a glimpse to more, but you'll soon see how it develops. Okay?
Could you elaborate just a little bit about Gan Eden? Did I hear you correctly that it's actually here in this world? I mean, is it here and we're just not able to access it? I mean, I'm being literal, I know, but I just
when you read the book of Genesis, it says that God created the world, and then where the four rivers meet, he said, "V'nar yotzem Eden," a river flowed out of Eden. This is all physical. And it flowed, and then it split into four rivers, and one of them is the Euphrates and the Tigris River and the other two rivers, and that's where the garden, he planted a garden. Essentially, on the map, it's somewhere where present day is southeastern Iraq. So I actually have on meaningfullife.com, I think it's called East of Eden or West of Eden, I think East of Eden, a whole article about where is Eden, where is Gan Eden. So there's no question that the world was created with a physical Garden of Eden. The question is what happened to it after Adam and Eve were banished and expelled from there. So because physically, so there are actually people who go to certain places in southeastern Iraq that say this is where Gan Eden is. I have a theory there. You have to look up the whole article. I wrote a whole discussion on it.
Thank you.
And just look it up. You'll see the details. There are different ways to understand it. But most likely, Gan Eden, the physical Gan Eden, went into concealment after they were banished. In other words, even though my theory is that it was covered by water, because in Chassidus it does say that Gan Eden is Gashmi, is Ruchni Shebegashmis. So when the world was more refined, you were able to see this physical place. The world is less refined; the physical got concealed, but the spiritual Gan Eden remains, of course, intact. And Gan Eden is where neshamas go, and that's where they bask, and that's where they benefit. That's where we say neshamas, after doing their work in this world, are benefiting from the divine revelation that they produced throughout their work in this world. They're eating from that, they're feeding off that divine energy that they generated through all their efforts. That's the brief story. I discussed it more at length when we learned it back on page 1254 and even earlier. But I would suggest reading those articles on meaningfullife.com. I elaborate much more at length about these Gan Eden.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're 3 lines from the bottom of page 1457. Another parenthesis. So he says like this now. I'll go slowly because it's pretty dense here, but I hopefully my explaining helped a bit. So he says now, parentheses, Ayin Beis al Mehus HaZiv chayesora daf kuf lamed beis amud aleph. He's telling us to delve and look into Ayin on this is a Beriyah. This is what probably the Mittler Rebbe, who compiled the explanation of Zohar, that the Alter Rebbe would for a period of time. Every Friday night, he would explain the Zohar of that week. So the Mittler Rebbe wrote them down and then compiled them into a book called Beriyah. And there's another Beriyah, Tzemach Tzedek, who explains these Maimorim with his gloss and his additions. So he says to look on the Mehus HaZiv, Chayesora, page 132a, that's in Zohar. What does he say there? He talks there about V'hinei, V'inyan, V'hinei Rivki Yitzas. So there it talks about the story that when Yaakov was going to, he left Be'er Sheva and was going to Charan, Parsha Vayetze. So it says that after his journey, he came to Lavan, his uncle's home, and he's looking, of course, he's going to ultimately seek his wife. It says Rivka came out, and that's with the story with the camels, and she fed his camels, and Rivka, it says Rivka Yitzas. Rivka, I'm sorry, no, I'm confusing it. No, that's the story with Rachel, my mistake. That's the story with Yaakov and Rachel. This goes Rivka, we're talking now Yitzchak's. Then when Eliezer, the Eved Avram, he was the servant of Avram. My confusion, I apologize. Going back to Chayei Sarah, actually. So when he came to look for a shidduch for Yitzchak, I confused it because the shidduch. So Eliezer, we know Avram sent his servant to go find a shidduch for Yitzchak. So when it says, when he came, it says Rivka Yitzas, and Rivka came out. So the Zohar says like this. What he explains in the Maimon HaZeir, he says, and that inyan, the neshamas hagvoyis, haklolius, he says these higher souls, the general higher souls, klolius means like neshamas, like Moshe Rabbeinu, the oves, and so on, sheheim b'bchinas merkava. They're in a state of a merkava, like we learned before, merkava meaning a chariot, completely dedicated to being a channel for Elokus, these higher souls. He used the word neshamas gavoyis earlier. If you recall in the previous paragraph, spoke about the neshamas gavoyis. Yeah, I just want to see. So he says like this: Hine b'halos man. Now these great souls, b'halos man, which means through the Avodah shalahem, through their halos man. Their work, man halos man, of course, refers to the elevation of mayin nukfin, the stimulation, the arousal, that which is self-generated from the Avodah below. Harihim nechnolim mamash b'chinas malchus. Remember that the neshamas, even the neshamas of Atzilus, we learned before from Ageres HaKedesh, are distant from the kav, and yotzu v'nifradu min hakelim, he said. If you look at the previous page, at the end of the paragraph, yotzu v'nifradu min hakelim, from the kelim of Malchus of Atzilus. In the state of Ibur, they were one. But then once they're born, these souls, even the highest souls like Moshe, they're now separate. So he's saying, but through halos man, he says in this explanation of the Zohar, the nechlolim mamash b'bchinas malchus. They get absorbed and subsumed in the level of malchus, ubehem mamash hu hayichud. Haynu shemei behem b'chinas shema d'Atzilus. And mamash in them is a yichud that they become completely unified, that in them radiates the Shema of Atzilus. Shema is, of course, the highest name of Bittul, Ma. Shema of Atzilus is radiating within them. Now, I'm not sure what he's coming to add here, to be honest. Is he coming to say that it's even higher than the state of Ibur? Because it's halos man? Most likely. In other words, he's referring again that Avodah does something that shifts the whole picture. The way God created the world is the world as he created it. But then comes Avodah. Remember, we learned that before the Avodah of Avram elevated him from Atzilus Beriyah to Atzilus Mamish. We learned now in the previous parentheses that the Avodah below elevates us from Mehus HaZiv to Mehus HaEtzem. And now he's saying that the neshamas gavoyes, which did separate, but through the halos man, they become encompassed to mamish, and ayichud mamish. So you need to say that this is higher than they were before they separated, meaning before the Ibur. Even though, again, he doesn't say it explicitly, or else you get back to the thing, what did halos man accomplish? So I want to look inside in the Beriyah Zohar, in this explanation of the Zohar, but the Rebbe Rashab is definitely bringing it here. So in other words, the Shleimus HaYira that the Neshamas have is the Shleimus HaYira they have naturally, and then there's the level they go even deeper in that through their halos man. That's most likely what he's saying here. But he's still talking about the high neshamas here. He says neshamas is gavoyes haklolis. Yeah. But now we want to discuss the next step. What happens to the souls as they come down below? Any questions before I continue? I'm literally the last words on this page now. Okay. Avol, now that we've established that neshamas are in a state of ibur and malchus, they're called b'nei Yerushalayim. What happens next? So avol, but, or however, kamoisha yardan neshama. Next page, 1458. Now, where the way a neshama comes down below, the nasa b'bchinas Beriyah. Till now, we were talking about Atzilus, Sheba Beriyah, Gan Eden, and everything associated with that. Now we're going further. The neshama comes down and becomes the level of Beriyah, not Atzilus Sheba Beriyah, Beriyah Mamish. Ein bo shleimus hayira. It no longer has the shleimus hayira, the Yerushalayim of Bnei Yerushalayim, because now it's coming down into a world of Beriyah, which most likely is not talking Gan Eden any longer either in Beriyah. It's now becoming part of existence. It's still a high world, Beriyah, but it's not the world of Atzilus, and it's not the world of Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. So now it's coming down, doesn't have the Shleimus Hayira. Mipnei Shasargoso B'chinas HaMetzias Levad. No longer Mehus, because now the neshama is not getting the personality even of the reflection. In other words, not even the personality of the artist. It's only getting the existence of the artist. Only Metzias Levad. So remember, we had Metzias, we had Mehus HaZiv, or Mehus HaAra, and then with Mehus HaEtzem. Now the neshama is coming to a place where things are getting more concealed. So yes, it's aware of the existence of the divine, but not the Mehus as it was by the Bnei Yerushalayim, which was either Atzilus Mamish or Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. So now we're talking about Metzias Levad. The Kolshkein, and how much more so? This is even in the world of Beriyah. How much more so is this concealment when the neshama comes down below? And it manifests in a body and an animal soul. So now we're talking about the neshama coming all the way down. So now the neshama has now become involved and become in a far more, we'll call it materialistic, or even more concrete physical sense. Hakshama doesn't necessarily mean gashmis, it means more gashmis, like more defined by the containers, by the outer reality. Atsha nitvasa biyeshes, to the point that this neshama, despite the levels it's coming from, the higher levels, is now contained by and defined by. Nitfesas, we've talked, the expression was also nitfes means it's grasped by. It's like it's affected by the yeshes. The yeshes means, yeshes doesn't necessarily mean here arrogance, but yeshes means the opposite of elikus. It's now having its own identity as it comes down below. And we see our neshamas in our bodies and animal souls, even though it's a chelik elikam emal mamish and has divine personality, but the fact is the neshama is very much controlled by and affected by the material desires and the material interests of this world. The nefesh habamis affects our neshama. That's why there's a battle, as he explains in Tanya. And the battle isn't always won by the nefesh halikis, because nefesh halikis has to contend with and is involved and engaged. Nefesh halikis is not aloof. It's not separate from the battles of this life. It's constantly battling. Even if the nefesh halikis prevails, it still takes a battle, as we all can testify in our own personal lives. So he's defining that as the neshama coming from a place of a pure place of shleimus hayira. Then it doesn't have shleimus hayira in Beriyah, and so much more so when it manifests inside of a body and an animal soul, it comes by hakshama. Hakshama means it's far more defined as a separate entity, or far more defined as by its external expression, external container, if you wish. Actually, it fesses to the point that it's now that fesses grasp, and it's I use the word defined. Nitfes means it's not removed from, it's engaged with biyeshus in the world, in the reality of yeshus, of self, of egocentric life, an egocentric life.
There.
So, one sec. You say you can't hear me, or you have a question?
No,
Okay.
I'm saying nitpeset.
I gave my translations. Excuse me. What do you want to say? Which word? You want to give a word for it?
S-T-U-C-K.
I can't hear you. What?
Yitzchak, we cannot hear you. Rabbi has good connection. You don't.
We can't hear you.
Stuck. S-T-U-C-K.
No, I would not use that word. That's already captivity. That's like being held hostage. He doesn't use that word. There's a word for that. That's what, it could end up being there, but nitfeses means that it's controlled by, defined by, it's now you have to basically so-called follow the rules of engagement. It's not removed from it all. That's the best way to really translate it. It could go into a stage of captivity and to the point of being like we learned earlier, like in prison, and we need to redeem it. They're called meitzar v'shivya are the words for that. But here he's saying that fesses biyeshus, which is really the situation with anyone that comes in this world. They have to engage with the world of yeshus, with the world of animal soul, the egocentricity of our identities. Okay, and then he goes further. Doesn't stop here. Ubefrat. So we talked Beriyah. Well, we talked B'nai Shishlam Atzilus Sheba Beriyah. Now we went to Beriyah. Now we went to Guf v'Nefesh Habamis Gashama and Nitfeses B'Yeshus. Ubefrat, and specifically Al Yedei Ha'alomes v'Astedim the Nefesh Habamis, the concealments and the coverings of the animal soul. So it's not just that it has to contend with an ego of the animal soul, but also the actual concealments and coverings of the animal soul. That through these concealments of the animal soul and its interests, what happens? The light, the energy, the consciousness of the divine soul gets concealed. Now, what did he add here? Till now, he wasn't talking about the halamas or stadium of the nefesh habamis. That's already the animal soul active. The mere fact that a neshama comes down into a body and animal soul, even at birth, even before the Yetzer Hara is active and the animal soul is active, that alone is already, it's been defined now by a state of ego. It has an independent self. Merkava, by contrast, Merkava of Atzilus, there's no self. Merkava is a chariot, a channel for the divine. It's a separate entity, whether it's state of Ibur or Leda, but it still doesn't have any of its own agenda. Even in Atzilus Sheba Beriyah, it's becoming more independent, but it's still completely aligned with godliness. But now, when you talk about the Guf and Nefesh Habam, and then Beriyah as well. So Beriyah becomes in a state of what he says that it's lost. It's no longer Shleimus Hayira. It doesn't have the utter bittul. But when it comes to Guf and Nefesh Habamis, it now has assumed a separate entity, a separate identity, I should say. It's a separate identity. It feels itself as separate. So it's a far cry from the Shama as it was in pregnancy, where there it was completely subsumed and absorbed in its mother. It's even not on the level of birth, but it's still within Atzilus because the Neshamas are a Merkava. Avraham Avinu was not in the womb, and neither was Moshe. But their lives on earth were completely Atzilus Mamish or Atzilus Sheba Beriyah or through Nisyanis Atzilus Mamish. But now we're talking about a soul that becomes a separate identity. And that's the first thing. And then it has to deal with now the halamas v'stadium of the animal soul, which conceal the divine soul's personality, divine soul's energy and consciousness. That's the battles and that's what we have to deal with on a daily basis. So it doesn't need much proof. Now we have the process. He started with the neshamas as they were, Bnei Yerushalayim, came down below, all the way to where we are. And now he's going to go back, and you'll see how it all connects. The Zehu, this goes back now to the beginning of the discussion back on page 1455. So as I said, it's 3 pages that he's discussed in the neshamas at length. And he says, now we'll understand. V'zehu shcheirani. And this is what the neshama says below. This neshama now below that is dealing with an animal soul as a separate, with its own ego, its own independent consciousness, and dealing with the concealments of the animal soul. This neshama says, Shcheirani, I am dark. The biridasa lamata, because in the soul's descent below, he bebchinas shachrus vehelam. The soul is in a state of shachrus, as in darkness and concealment. The word shachrus comes from the word shacher, dark, shcheira. Shenechshach eira, its light has become dimmed or even darkened. Ubein arech legamri, and infinitely distant from where it originated. L'kamoy shehi lamayla shenikon abreis Yerushalayim, infinitely distant from the way the soul is above, which is the level of Bnei Yerushalayim, which is why I interpreted initially that the neshama below is talking to its own counterpart above, which is pretty clear what he's saying here. No, it's not talking about 2 sets of neshamas, talking about the same neshama. But again, that's open for discussion. I'm not saying anything definitive. So that's what the neshama is saying, Shcheirani, because due to my descent below, I've been darkened and concealed, to the point that I'm quite of infinite, I'm far cry. I've traveled very far from where the neshama was Lamaila when it was called Bnei Yerushalayim Shleimus Hayira, utter bittul. But then the neshama continues and says, "Makom mokim v'nova." Yes, I'm dark, but nevertheless I'm beautiful. Shebezed dafke, because it's specifically through this descent where I went into a darkened state, Nasaba Yisrein Dover, some advantage, some virtue was contributed, something great was generated. Mashaloi Hoye ba neshama lamayla, that didn't exist in the neshama above. So on one hand, yes, the neshama has come down and taken a very big leap as it came down below, but Vinova, I'm beautiful, because something happens in this world through this descent that the neshama lamayla did not have. And what is that? The biridosa lamata, that in the descent below of the soul, nasis bebchinas kala, it becomes in a state of kala. Kala is a bride, but kala comes from the word lashon kiloyin. Kiloyin means to be dissolved. To be dissolved. When you say kiloyin, let's say kiloyin hapsila, the wick gets dissolved as it burns. The wick is absorbing, is drawing the fuel, the oil, and becoming a flame. So it says it's kiloyin hapsila. So what happens below is that the neshama comes in a state of dissolvement. Hainu, what does that mean? In Avodah, teikef hatshukev atsemoyin b'yeser. It's only below that the soul develops such an intense yearning and thirst, b'yeser, an increasing level. Sheba min arichuk dafke. It comes specifically, explicitly from distance. When the neshama is close and it feels that it's like a fish in water, and it feels connected to its source, it doesn't have such a thirst. A fetus in its mother's womb, or in the spiritual, nimshal, the moral, a soul in Atzilus that's connected, or even if it's not connected, Leido, but it's an neshama of Atzilus or Atzilus Beriyah, these higher levels, doesn't have thirst. Why would it have thirst? It's in the water. It's experiencing godliness all the time. It's only when the soul gets darkened, when it comes into this world, that it develops this tremendous thirst and longing and yearning and pining. These are all good translations of the word Shukka and Samoyin. Ukamoshe Kosav, Mizmel David, B'Yese Bamidbar, Yehuda. Mizmel David, the song to David when he was in Midbar Yehuda, when he was in the desert, in the wilderness, in the Judean wilderness. Bamidbar Dafke. That's when the Mizmar came, when he was in the wilderness. Somalachon Afshi. The Eretz Sia v'Oyif, Bli Moyim. When he was in the Eretz Sia v'Oyif, in the arid, dry land without water, that's where Somalachon Afshi. That's where his soul thirsts and develops that element of thirsting. Dafke, Bli Mayim Dafke. So what do you see from all this? The Eretz Sia, Bli Mayim. That in the Eretz Sia, in the arid or dry land, without water, she'ena irva gilisham, which is referring that there's no light and there's no revelation. It's dark, shcheira. It's a dark state. Dafkin in that place, dafke there. Sham dafke nasat samayim b'yeser. That's where the greatest thirst is developed and generated, specifically in the darkest place, as the neshama comes down below. So that's what happens to the neshama here below that doesn't exist. That level of thirst, that level of yearning and longing is not there when the neshama is above in Bnei Yerushalayim. It's not finished yet. It's going to discuss this more at length, but that's the brief conclusion of the word Shcherani. They said the next two paragraphs he's going to continue. Well, more than two. What am I saying? The next good few pages, all the way till probably bottom of page 1462. He's going to discuss now this this additional element that happens through a neshama lamato, which of course immediately, if you recall what we learned earlier, brings us back to Einoid, that dafka, the distress and the helam down below, the darkest moments of the distress of the soul is what brings it to the highest states, revealing the helam ha'atzmi. Didn't use that language yet, but this is the similar idea that it's below, in the darkest place, where you get an access, the highest level of tzemoyin. But right now, he hasn't yet discussed what level of godliness it reveals. He's talking more on the gavra, the person. On a personal level, this develops a tremendous thirst, a tremendous surge, and a tremendous passion, if you wish, what he called kala from the word kiloy. And that concludes the paragraph here on page 1458. Let me stop here for questions.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by the way the Rebbe is presenting. It seems like it's a little at odds with the Tanya, the Tanya said there's two separate souls. Here it says there's two aspects of the same soul. Maybe I'm a little.
I mean, what are you referring? I don't know what you're referring. What
the divine soul, the divine soul versus the animal soul. So it seems like there's it is almost a schizophrenic, split personality.
Hold on.
Or is it two separate things?
Let's suppose this. In Tanya, he talks about two souls, and he's talking here about two souls. Where do you see a difference?
No, because here it seems like the soul has he became aware, non-selfless. There was a little bit of
But the same thing. The same thing happens. That's the whole Tanya, is that the divine soul and the animal soul are two separate souls, but they join together in one person, and they battle all the time. Who's going to control the faculties and the thought, speech, and action of the person? So the divine soul is constantly fighting with an animal soul, and it has to deal with it. It's like it's not a matter of a book. Look in our own lives. You have a divine soul, but the divine soul in this world doesn't just have free reign. It's completely engaged with the animal soul and has to constantly contend with it. There's a battle going on. So he's saying the nefesh, the neshama, as it comes down, is slapsha begufa nefesh abamis, and now it's dealing, and to the point that the soul is affected by that. Where in Tanya, he never says that the soul is not affected by the animal soul.
Oh, in other words, and there is in other words, the reason is in some ways a going down of the godly soul is that he comes across an animal soul that influences him. Not that he changes. It seems
He
like
doesn't say that the divine soul becomes an animal soul. says the divine soul manifests and engages with the divine animal soul to the point that it's now defined by it. As a matter of fact, in Tanya, he says, except for a tzaddik, we are defined by our guf and nefesh habamis, not by our neshama, because neshama is not the dominant force in our life.
Okay, just one more question. Where does the nefesh habamis come from? The source of that it's because we said
we learned earlier that it comes from the malachim, the Pnei Aryeh, the Merkava, Pnei Aryeh, Pnei Sheir. It ultimately originates from the world of Tohu. I mean,
okay, now I understand it much better. Thank you very much. I got confused whether it's a Ben. He became it. Okay, it's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Any other questions?
Yes, two questions, please. One, it says here when it comes down, it's nitfas in the Yeshus and the Nefesh Bahamas, and it becomes shchorani. My question is it says ha'alamos v'histarim, the Nefesh Bahamas, sheni salam al yedei zeh, or Nefesh Elokis. So is the Nefesh Elokis actually it's Simon that's yearning for godliness that comes from this concealment? Is the only change that's happening when it says it's Lil Gamre, it's a totally different existence, the Nefesh Elokis, when it comes down into Yeshus and Nefesh Bahamas and Shchorani? Is it simply because of its total concealment? It's being concealed. It doesn't change intrinsically, internally. The Nefesh Elokis is not affected internally by the darkness of the Nefesh Bahamas. It's just concealed. The light is totally concealed. It's a different. The revelation of Nefesh Elokis and Atzilus is completely different than the revelation of Nefesh Elokis Lamata Masar Tfachim. Or is it also additionally, does it actually change the intrinsic wiring, so to speak? Does it have an internal effect on the Nefesh Elokis besides just concealing it?
Well, why don't we use the classic example given in Chassidus, where a king sends his child away from the palace, which is Hashem sending away the soul from Gan Eden and from the higher worlds to a distant land where no one recognizes, and the child is made to forget the Torah that it learned in its mother's womb. So what happens to us? Why don't we just look at ourselves in the mirror? Our divine soul is there. Has it been impacted by the Halamas Vestadim? I would say quite intensely. Has it intrinsically rewired the divine soul? Well, we know that the Etzem neshama remains intact. But I would definitely think that lower levels of the neshama are absolutely influenced. And they can even change. That's why we need to have schar v'einish, cause and effect. You even need to have gehenim. It's not just for the animal soul. It's also because we get toxic. You know, when you are a healthy person and you're living in a dysfunctional family, you could ask the question, does your healthy personality get affected by the toxins of your family? The answer is an essential part of you probably does not get affected, but I'm sure there are plenty of layers that do get affected. So it all depends on the individual, it all depends on the circumstances. But this goes back to what he explains in Tanya and other places, that our garments get soiled. And ultimately also, listen, when the whole Tanya talks about when the person uses their mind, instead of using it to learn Torah and connect to God, they use it for selfish purposes, or even for neutral purpose, but it's all about money, materialism. Or it's even for nefarious purposes, for bad things. So the moyach there's a tumor that goes into the mind, and that tumor affects the nefesh elokis. It's a real tumor. It's a real impurity. It's toxic. The question is what extent, and does that mean that we get damaged to the point that you can't be, God forbid, afal pisha chata Yisrael. But you're essentially asking the question. It's not really Tanya, Ayin Beis. This is the essential question of all of Tanya and all of Chassidus. How deep is the divine soul affected by this world? So the answer is depending how far a person has fallen, God forbid. You know, I know people who unfortunately, tragically, have become so toxic and so addicted and so unhealthy that their divine soul, there's no question, is really been is a deep gullus. Now, that doesn't mean, is it hopeless? No. We know there's always the spark is there. But sometimes the spark, as we know with Shol Shlippus Atmeis, there's also a divine spark. And yet it's very difficult to redeem because it's trapped in a very deep way. So I think it's a matter of case by case, and knowing that there's always hope for everybody because the divine soul is always alive, even when it seems completely concealed. So it's hard for me to diagnose and say how much of the divine soul is never going to be altered fundamentally because it's divine by nature. But the fact of the matter is, look what happens in situations where tremendous corruption, tremendous decadence that affects people with divine souls will fall into very dark places. So to say that it's nothing, it's meaningless. It's just like, you know what, just change your shirt and everything is good. No, people have hurt each other. People have killed each other. There are things that you're chayiv misa for in Torah, because a person does enough damage to another person, whether they kill them or they hurt them in very deep ways. Sometimes the only redemption is for their lives to be capital punishment. That tells you how deep the transgression can be. But that gets into the whole discussion of Torah and mitzvahs, and I don't like reward and punishment. I'd rather use cause and effect. But it's like when you get a splinter in your finger. Sometimes it's superficial. You can easily get the splinter out of the finger. Sometimes you need, God forbid, surgery. And sometimes you need amputation. Rahman al-Islam, obviously. I'm just using it as an example. So that already comes down to the levels. The Torah tells us which so-called displacements, I'm using that word instead of sins, which displacements and disalignments and dissonance requires what type of tikkun to repair it, what type of tshuva, what type of repair, what type of return.
But if we say
sorry, you
we
had
say
another
that-
question.
Yeah, well, just to follow up on that, and then quick other question there. But if we say that Nefesh Elokis is a chelik elokam mamash, it's part of infinity, etzem, which doesn't change no matter what. It's like it doesn't change. So your answer seems to say
This is the first time you have this question in your life?
No, not at all.
So why does the Torah require capital punishment?
We're learning to a shachar ani, and as we read, Lamata is specifically.
Look. Let me put it this way: your questions are not on Ayin Beis. Your questions are on Tanya, really. I just want to clarify that, and that's on many places. I'm fine to discuss it because it relates to what we're discussing here. But the whole time, I mean, did you ever hear that the Nefesh Elokis is in Golus? That
Right,
word,
so,
Golus?
1 second.
So what happens to the Chelik Elokam Mal Mamish if it's in Golus?
Because it's concealed. The light of it is concealed, doesn't shine.
But you don't think the Nefesh Elokis is affected by being in Golus?
Well, that's my question.
Of course it's affected. That's why I just said to you, why do you need capital punishment? Why do you need all types of real work to cleanse the Nefesh Elokis if it wasn't affected? Of course it's affected.
I guess you said only the external levels, maybe not the panemius of the Nefesh Elokis can never be changed. Is never affected by anything. No,
you think if somebody murdered another person, you think the Nefesh Elokis is completely oblivious of that and is not affected by it?
A certain level of it, yes. The panemius of
it's not just external; it's quite profound, to the point the Torah may say that person deserves to die. Why would the Nefesh Elokis have to be taken? Why do they have to separate? Because the toxins went deep enough. I mean,
the person is killed, but the Nefesh Elokis is eternal.
What are we going to say? You want to eliminate all crimes that really don't mean much? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, I'm saying that the person in capital punishment, the person has to die, but the Nefesh Elokis is eternal in that person, and we'll go to Gan Eden eventually, hopefully.
Eventually, but why does it have to go through Gehenim or Chibut HaKever or Kafakela?
Okay.
Because it's been affected. It's been affected.
Remember,
it's been affected, and not only affected. Remember, the Nefesh Elokis is involved in some extent as well. And what happens if the person justified it in the name of Torah and used religion to abuse other people? Is the Nefesh Elokis affected by that?
I would say that in the deepest
anyway, my
level
answer is yes, it's affected. The level of effect depends, it's case by case.
Okay. Now, the second question I have was...
And just for the record, it says in the Gemara that even Hashem is affected. it says that when a person sins, God says, my arm hurts, my head hurts. We have to understand what that means. But it says so. It says, Shchinta begalusa, an imi anechi b'tzara, that God has pain when we're in Golus, and the Shekhinah is also in Golus. I know it needs explanation, but it's not so if the Shekhinah could be in Golus, the Chelik Elikam and Mal could definitely be.
And the second question.
Look, listen. One second.
Yeah.
A Rebbe is at Sadi Gomer, right? Doesn't have a Nefesh Abamis. And the Rabbeim have pain? Were they ever in pain?
Yes, for the pain of course.
Okay, so it means they're directly affected by. Okay,
that's a great
the
level of impact.
That's a good
I told
one.
you the level of impact is case by case, but there's definitely an impact, and it's not purely superficial. It's not just superficial. It's not like you just, or else there wouldn't be the need for Chodesh Elul and Tishrei and deep tshuva me'umke deliba. I mean, tshuva is not just for the nefesh habamis.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Outside of Gomor, like the Rebbe, is he in pain? Because if he's not affected, he wouldn't be in pain. But at the same time, the Rebbe knows that everything
is nitfus, because like he said, because it's nitfeses b'yeshes to the point that is directly affected. That's how God made it. The neshama does not remain aloof and separate from this world. It has to engage, and it's invested, and it's affected for the positive and also affected in the negative. Okay, next question. You said,
the second question was this Simone for the Chuka and Simone Toka of Chuka. That's an advantage that comes from being in the midbar, b'shchorani, the advantage of it, the benefit of it, of being in the midbar. My question to you is that unfortunately, not every Jew in their life, and we see it empirically when they come down, will have that. They'll live their whole life without that chukka at all apparent in their life. So is this shchorani but nava, right?
yeah.
Nava, the beauty, that's only if they have that chukka, no? Or you're saying that they would have that, Nefesh Elokis has that chukka, even though on a reality level, empirical level, they could go their whole life, not know word of God, and never have that chukka for God.
I hear the question. So I'll answer on several a multifold answer. I'll give you a multiple. Number one is on the most basic level, he's talking about obviously somebody who the darkness has caused them to have this thirst.
Right.
Like for example, in the world of recovery, there are people who have not hit rock bottom yet, and they're not even going for recovery, even though they need it. And they need to reach a place where it's dark enough and arid enough and dry enough for them to say enough is enough and have to do something about it. So at the most basic level, he's talking about obviously someone, a neshama that feels the distress and feels the thirst and so on. That's basic. Second point, what we like to say, we often hear that every neshama at some point is going to cry out. It may not act on it, but like when you say why a Jew goes to Shul and Yom Kippur, or may have a Seder Tshuva out of nowhere, out of the blue, especially in Aseret Simei Tshuva, that's because the soul, throughout the year, maybe not feels it, but there are times that suddenly some people go to Eretz Yisrael and they stand by the Kaisel, or they meet somebody they haven't seen in years. They see somebody putting on tefillin, they put on tefillin, they start crying like a child, or they go to a Seder table. What we say is that's happening is that the soul that has been so trapped in this darkness for so long is like suddenly felt coming home. So even though you've been estranged from your parents, something awakens. So we believe that no matter what, anywhere, anytime can be neseder that way. He says that in Tanya clearly, that any moment, every neshama can be awakened. If it actually is or not is another question, but it could be. And there are times that happens, and that's why we have to be there. You never know when that spark will ignite. And finally, I would say, in the mysteries of God's plan, the fact that in our generation there's so many Tanekah Shenishbu, that the majority of the Jewish people are assimilated, even intermarried, and to the point where you meet them, you said empirically, you can't see b'derech hateva how they're going to discover God. You think about generational intermarriage. There's nothing about them that there's an identity of a Jew almost left, God forbid. You can't see. So this already goes into God's mystery. Why did he allow that? And what's the purpose of their neshama coming down below? And you have to also then go into the cumulative schusim. Remember, all these neshamas that are here today, even in the darkest places, also had grandparents that most likely were moiser nefesh at some point. So what's the shlichus of this neshama? Maybe it has to finish something. Maybe it has to do a favor for somebody. It's not easy to measure what means thirst. Thirst doesn't necessarily always mean in the most dramatic way that somebody gets up and say, hey, enough is enough. My life is miserable. My soul is in darkness and I want God. It could be a person out there that is so assimilated, but when the moment comes, they meet the right person, they save a person's life. We don't know the mysteries of how neshamas work. And especially, we're not talking about isolated generation. We're talking about a cumulative. We're at the end of a process of thousands of years. And therefore, a lot of the darkness, the shcheirani we see today, the spark that comes may be very different than you and I may imagine it. And we don't know. This is up to God. Like, the Baal Shem Tov says, and the neshama comes down below, live 70, 80 years, toil 70, 80 years, just to do one favor for a person. Another person could be a complete shemer Torah mitzvahs and doing everything and not fulfill that purpose why they came to do a favor. Another person may not necessarily be a shemer Torah mitzvahs, but they do the favor for which the neshama came down. Just giving an example. So we don't know these mysteries, and it's very hard to establish. So when you take all that in account, everything I just said, you realize that Shcheira Nivanova can mean many things.
Are you done, Eliezer? Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
That's
Well,
what I have to say.
I heard what we said, the explanation. What I was trying to get out is the Nava part. Is that guaranteed to any Jewish soul in this world?
Well,
no
we have an expression
that
that every soul will be redeemed. Yeah, the answer is yes.
I have a question. If you're done,
and how revealed it is, and whether we always are zeicha to see it. That's like, hey, listen, I do this work 24/7. I meet thousands of people. Some you see immediately your impact on them. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're zeicha, you merit to see it. Sometimes you're not. Maybe it has an impact. 30 years later, I meet somebody and I hear something impacted them. It's a journey. It's a mysterious journey. But for sure, neshama at the end of the day is divine, and that will never disappear. The question is how long it takes and how painful it will be, and excruciating in the process. But this goes into, as I said, the whole picture of all the generations. The Rebbe says that we're at the threshold of Geula, and all the work was done, and we only have to open our eyes, and there's just a few things to still finish. Where the Berurim are done. So all that goes as part of this conversation. So our job is to do whatever we can with whoever we can reach. We're not statisticians, and we're not doing a poll here, and we're not going to figure out numbers. It's not a numbers game. We have to do our part in revealing godliness to every person we meet. And we believe that if you do it right, as much as we can do, God will do the rest, and the neshama will respond. So the Shcheira and Ivanova responds in many ways. I've met people who you may not think there's the Vanova, and I see it. I see tremendous beauty in them. And I don't like to be negative, but I will show you beauty in some places that are so dark. And then when you go to places you think are bright, and it's much darker than we think it is. So, as a matter of fact, this is common. I see this on an ongoing basis. The Shcheira Nivanova. So we have to do our work in helping facilitate the process.
And this is changing the subject, but it's actually coming to talk about
Eliezer,
Ayin Beis.
is Eliezer, you're done with the questions, or you're?
Yeah, no, fine. Yitzhak can ask his questions. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Go ahead.
Mine's, I think, a lot simpler. I don't know. When he says that in the Yerida of the neshama into the nefesh, into the goof, it says to be Yerida salamata nice b'chinas kala, lashon kilayan. So when he says it's a level of kala, I understand that it's the notion of dissolution, dissolvement. Use the word. I'm wondering if he means it just for that purpose only, or if the pun, if you will, if you forgive me using the word pun, that they means to say we are like a kala, and there's something about a kala that's not quite yet wedded to her husband, that she's in this state of potential unification, right, with her husband, but still in some state of limbo. So like am I making the, because let's not forget we're in this whole mashal of Benos Yerushalayim, and if you think about like the Churban and the Inyan of like an Eicha, Bas Yerushalayim, and the sort of the expulsion of the bride from the wedding chamber, whatever you want to call it. This imagery of a banished bride, right, is a I'm just wondering if you can read into that, or no, it's just a word, and it means that it's dissolved. It's not on its own. It's lost. It's nitpesed. It's caught up in something. My
answer to that would be I would look into my Morim on Shcheira Nivanova and see if the Alter Rebbe in L'Kutei Torah elaborates more on Kala. What you're saying is possible, part of it. Maybe there's more details. He doesn't cite here more. And I would not just stop here. As I said, this has a source. I mentioned when we began the subject that this is, that we should look in L'Kutei Torah. There's my Morim Shcheira Nivanova in L'Kutei Torah Shir HaShirim. So I would begin looking there, seeing what he speaks about there, about Bnei Yerushalayim, and does he make reference to Kala in the context like you said? It's possible. Remember, we're coming from 15th of Av, so it says the Bnei Yerushalayim go out in the fields on the 15th of Av in order to become a Kala, in order to find a Shidduch. So it's possible that it's that imagery and that description being that Matan Torah is Yem Chasan Osei, Chasan and the Golas is the Kala and the Chasan are separated. It's very possible. I don't want to read more into what the Rebbe Rashab is saying because he only says this. But I think that's when you look in the sources of these Mamorim, and there could very well be more elaboration about this idea of Kala.
Okay, I got some homework today. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
By the way, this is a phenomenal class. This one, and the questions in particular, excellent questions, and your answers really opening up. And I want to thank Svi and Eliezer for their very excellent questions, which I had to some extent myself. So really, really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, so we're stopping here. End of the paragraph on 1458. And you see the next paragraph continues the discussion of the midbar, of the thirst of the midbar and the nova. So more to come. Let me stop.